Hello, my name's Pete Wildman. I'm a local preacher based at Little Sutton Methodist Church in Ellesmere Port. If you've passed our church recently, you might have seen a banner that says, "The building's temporarily closed, but the church is open. The church is the people, and we're here for you." And as part of what we're here for, we're sharing these messages of good news for bad times. Last Sunday, Christians all around the world celebrated Pentecost, the birthday of the church. It took place 50 days after Jesus' death and resurrection, and about 10 days after his ascension, his return to heaven. Before he left the earth and left his disciples, he gave them a great commission. He said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel. Reach everyone with the good news." And this is what we're doing. Now, if you wind forward 2,000 years, hundreds of millions of people around the world are followers of Jesus. So really, those early disciples managed to start something which has rolled on for centuries. But it's probably true to say that in this day and age, certainly in the Western world, it's such an old story that really it's lost its way with many people. There's only a very hazy idea about what the message of the gospel, the good news, really is. And many people have never stopped to consider who Jesus is and why his life and his death and his resurrection might be of significance and importance to them. In these days of lockdown, it seems that many people are beginning to ask themselves some of these big questions. Faced with this, just the latest disaster in the earth, and with the future of the world at stake in many ways, people are beginning to wonder about where we're going and whether there is any meaning in what's going on. So these short talks are our way of sharing what God says about good news. Pentecost, when this happened, is one of the great feasts of the Jewish people, still is today. And at this time, tens of thousands of people from all around the known world would have gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate their harvest festival. It was one of the great feasts that they came together for. So when around 3,000 people on this day became followers of Jesus en masse, immediately as they returned to all their homes across the known world, cells of Christians began everywhere. There were believers across the world. But this happened in response to a sermon from Peter. Peter the Apostle stood up and explained about who Jesus was, what his death meant, that he was resurrected from the dead, that he ascended to heaven. In other words, the four things which right through the last 2,000 years have been preached as the basis of the message of the good news. And during these talks we'll look at each one of these in turn and we'll explore a little bit what they mean. But for this introduction, I wanted to focus not so much on the message, but on the messenger, Peter. Most people know he was one of the first apostles called by Jesus from being a fisherman. He was untutored. He wasn't a scholar. He'd had a basic education. He spent 3 years with Jesus. During that time, he veered from being his greatest supporter and acknowledging him as being God and being the Messiah and being the Master, and then at other times tapping him on the shoulder and not being slow to give him some advice as to how he could fulfill his mission in a better way. Don't do this, Master. There's a better way of doing this. You don't need to die. Jesus on one occasion even called him Satan. He said, "Get behind me. You don't know what you're talking about." Of course, all this culminated in the night of Jesus' arrest and trial, when Peter 3 times denied that he knew Jesus. 3 times with curses, he said he was nothing to do with him. So 6 weeks later, how come this same Peter is standing up boldly in front of an audience of thousands of people, hundreds of whom would have been in Jerusalem when these events happened, dozens, scores of whom would have been part of the very people he was afraid of, the ones who had condemned Jesus to death, the ones with the authority and the power in Jerusalem. And yet he had no problem facing them up with their actions and the consequences of what they'd done, and accusing them of having put to death the very Messiah that they longed for and believed in. So what had changed? Well, 3 things, and this is what we're going to be looking at in future videos. First of all, Jesus had risen from the dead. Peter knew this. He was convinced of it. And from someone who was frightened of the consequences of following Jesus, he was now someone who would stand up boldly and say, "Look, this is the truth. Make of it what you will." If Jesus had risen from the dead, what had he to be afraid of? And then secondly, Jesus had ascended into heaven. Jesus, he knew now, was the real power on earth. And what could human power say or do in the face of that power? Jesus was ascended. Jesus was the King. Jesus was the Lord. He was gripped by that truth. And then finally, the Holy Spirit had come upon the church in mighty power, accompanied by signs, wonders, by the disciples all breaking out into languages that they didn't understand but were well understood to the people around from all parts of the world who heard their native languages being spoken. That's what made them come and stop and listen and give attention to this. It was a very distinct, miraculous event, and it attracted their attention. So Peter knew Jesus had risen from the dead. Peter knew Jesus as the Lord and Master of all. He was gripped by that truth, and Peter was filled with the power of God. And over 2,000 years, nothing's really changed. Those 3 things remain true for Christians. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We believe that Jesus is the King. And we're gripped by the truth of the relationship that through the Holy Spirit God has brought about in our lives, so that we know God and we follow God in a very real way. We know his presence, we feel his presence day by day. This is good news for bad times. God bless.